Welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Right.
And we are on this Parsha of Ekev, and the third Parsha of Deuteronomy. And we are actually we're reading, studying what is called the second paragraph of the Shema, uh, which also is called Kabbalat ol mitzvot, the acceptance of the yoke of the mitzvot. And just to do a quick review, in our prayer book, in our Siddur, when it comes to reciting the Shema, that is to say that the recitation of the Shema refers to the recitation of three paragraphs, two from Deuteronomy and one from Numbers. We actually saw the first paragraph in the previous Parsha of Et Hanan, and I believe it's Deuteronomy 6 in that chapter. And here we are looking at that second paragraph, and then the third paragraph is from Numbers, and it speaks of the tzitzit, the commandment to put on the fringes on the corners of our garments, which is to remind us of all the other mitzvot. So there's the whole idea here of the relationship that we have with God. And the first paragraph is called Kabbalat Ol Malchut Shamayim, the acceptance of the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, meaning a willingness for the notion of having the divine creator be your commander, your ruler, your sovereign, and the idea of following those specific commands that are found in the Torah and are developed within our tradition. And certainly the Ten Commandments, the very foundation of it all. But the very notion here in that paragraph, basically of the concept, in other words, breaking it down into the concept of starting off with the idea that one is willing to accept a power greater than oneself as one's authority, and that's a Kabbalat Ol Malchut Shamayim, the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. The reason for the term yoke, the metaphor of a yoke, Y-O-K-E, is the idea of the way in which an ox is controlled and directed, and the reason why a yoke is opposed to a bridle, which you use on a horse, is that an ox has a very strong neck, and the yoke is actually a lever by which you can lever the neck of the ox, and as one assumes that the ox moves in the direction that it's facing, and that's how they would control an ox. So there's this notion that within us, of course, we are stubborn. We don't want to be told what we do. I will give you my favorite quote, which is, "Ain't no one going to tell me what to do." And the idea of saying, wait a second, I am going to let God tell me what to do. And so that's the idea of the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. And then the second paragraph has to do with the acceptance of the mitzvot, of understanding that the commandments are the way in which God is going to rule on us, because one certainly can have a notion of belief in God. One certainly can have an idea of God being your divine commander. You can do that. That doesn't necessarily mean that you accept the Torah and that you accept the specific commandments in the Torah. And that's the second paragraph. And then, of course, the third paragraph is a specific mitzvah, right? A specific mitzvah of putting on these fringes to remind you of all the other fringes. So it sort of hangs together very beautifully in terms of the process by which one comes to accept God as your sovereign in a very specific kind of way and not in a generalized way. And I will leave you to draw your own conclusions as to how valid and how honest this is. At any rate, right before we're in the midst of this paragraph, and we are being told here that if we in fact follow these commandments, God will send the rain at its due time, and that our crops will be successful, that we will be able to gather in our harvest. And I think that, while I understand it on a literal level, I think it is also can be understood on a metaphoric level, because very few of us are actually practicing farming. We all benefit from the farmers, but we ourselves are not engaged necessarily in farming practices. But we can, in a metaphoric sense, understand that we all have our farming to do in a sense of the work that we have to do, and we all reap our harvests, depending again on what we are doing. And the idea of having lives that have success and essentially the ability to harvest and reap the consequences of our behaviors. And so I see it that way as well, that in some ways this is a very strong and affirmative statement that that we have accountability as human beings, as individuals, and also as a community. And we sort of talked about the fact that where certain commandments that are mentioned in the first paragraph are mentioned again in the second paragraph. Rashi points out that in the first paragraph, they're mentioned in the singular, and in the second paragraph, they're mentioned in the plural to indicate that it's not the same thing when an individual is practicing it and a community is practicing the mitzvot, that they both have their own levels of significance. So here we go. Continuing now with the blessing. V'natati esev bisadcha livhemtecha, and I shall place grass in your field for your cattle. V'achalta, and you shall eat. V'savata, and you shall be satisfied. So let's take a look at it here. Rashi. V'natati esev bisadecha. Bisadcha, excuse me. I shall put grass in your field, and this is now from the Sifrei. Shelo titztarech laholicha lemidbariot. The point here is that he says, look at the whole phrase, I shall place grass in your field for your cattle. And Rashi says, as the Sifrei recognizes the subtle distinction of grass in your field and its relationship to cattle, that you will not need to take your cattle out into the open fields, right? In other words, unowned fields to graze, that the grazing will be right there. In other words, a subtle point about the comfort that God is going to send. Davar acher, another interpretation of this particular phrase. Shetiyeh gozez tuatcha kol yemot hageshamim, that you will be able to, gozez means to like cut, right? To reap your produce all the days of rain, meaning wintertime, right? Because it's a Mediterranean climate, and the yemot hageshamim, the days when rain falls, is wintertime. Umashlich lifnei behemtecha, and you will be able to cast it before your cattle. Va'ata monea yadcha mimena, and you are then able to withdraw monea to. In other words, it means to take away your hand, mimena, from it. Shloshim yom, 30 days. You're not going to have, in other words, you're going to be able to provide enough fodder for your cattle, right? And you don't have to do anything for 30 days, kodem lakatzir, prior to the actual reaping, right, to the full reaping of your harvest. Ve'ena pochetet midegana, and there will not be any less corn, any less of the wheat and the barley, etc., of that harvest. You won't have any less. So you're going to have plenty. You're going to be able to reap enough for your cattle to feed them, and it's not, in fact, going to reduce the actual harvest that you have. V'achalta v'savata, and you shall eat and be satisfied. Hare zo bracha acheret. He says, this is a whole new blessing. This is a whole different bracha, blessing. Shetahe bracha mitzuya papat, that there is actually a blessing to be found in your pot here, in your bread, pat is bread, betoch hame'ayim, within your innards, meaning you can have food, but it doesn't have to satisfy you. So there's not only the blessing of food, but the fact that in your insides, right, as you digest this, you find satisfaction and you have sufficiency in the amount, right? Va'achalta v'savata. you shall eat, and you shall be satisfied. Let's see if there's any more Rashi on this at this point. No. So I'm going to tell you that there is a classic interpretation here of the sentence that Rashi doesn't quote here, but where it says, I shall give you enough grass in your field for your cattle, and you shall eat and be satisfied. And from there's a halacha that before you eat, va'achalta, you make sure that your animals have enough to eat first, right? So that's from this verse as well. And in fact, to the extent that you can say hamotzi, right? You can make the blessing over your bread, and you know that following a blessing of such a kind of a blessing, of appreciation, you're supposed to perform the mitzvah immediately. In other words, the idea is that if you make hamotzi, you break the bread and eat it immediately following the blessing. That there's something disrespectful about making the blessing and then having a large pause or doing something else even before you go ahead and eat the bread. There is, however, I think there are two exceptions. The one exception is that you're supposed to, when you make the bracha over the bread, you're supposed to have it with some salt, okay? And you can say, pass the salt before you eat the bread so that you can eat the bread with salt. And it's not considered an interruption because it's an essential part of eating the bread. And the other exception is you can pause and say, have you fed the animals? Have you fed the animals between the blessing itself and consuming the bread? Interesting little detail that I wanted to share with you. Going on. Now, so far, so good. Hishamru lachem. Be very careful. Be on guard. Guard yourselves. Pen yivteh levavchem. Lest your hearts seduce you. V'sartem, and you turn aside. V'avadatem Elohim acherim, and you serve other gods. V'hishtachavitem lahem, and you bow down to them. So, what's significant is the way the Torah casts idolatry actually as fetishism. What we're describing here could more be described as fetishism and not idolatry. But it's possible that the Torah is trying to use vivid language in describing idolatry. And idolatry essentially is worshiping anything other than the divine, transcendent creator, the one ultimate existent one, God. That is idolatry. And the next sort of issue to explain is when we talk about worship. What is it when you worship something? And when it's talking about serving, etc., other gods, think about it. So let's say we worship money, right? If we want to say we worship money and we want to say serve money, it means you do whatever it takes to achieve money. If you believe, again, this is all part of the worship of it. If you believe that money will solve all your problems, that having lots and lots and lots of money will solve all the problems that you have, that you'll be able to, it'll be your source of power, it'll be your source of strength, of control, of all the problems that you have, money will solve it. That is making money your idol. And in fact, that is explanation of worshiping the golden calf. That is exactly what we mean by this. But the point is, when it talks about serving, it's not that you're bowing down to money other than possibly emotionally, but it means essentially that you'll do whatever it takes. You'll cheat, you'll rob, you'll steal, you'll kill, you'll do whatever it is to achieve the money. And of course, money is a great idol. It is not the only idol. There are other things that one can serve as well, but money is probably one of the largest ones. And you can ask yourself if, in fact, that is an idol that is alive and well these days, and whether human beings, in fact, do practice idolatry in worshiping money. Now, the point that I want to make also and underline, because I don't think money is bad, right? I don't think wealth is a bad thing. It's only when you serve it, it's only when you worship it that it becomes a bad thing. But if you don't worship it, okay, that's okay. And in fact, it is a great source of comfort and a great blessing to be blessed with wealth because you can do a lot of very good things. And there are many people in this world who bring great blessing into this world because they themselves prospered and they didn't cheat, they didn't steal, they didn't rob in order to gain that wealth. And they realize that the wealth isn't just for their own personal use, but that it gives them the opportunity to be philanthropic, etc., etc. So I want to make sure I say that because I could give the wrong impression, because unfortunately, there are people who will do whatever it is to achieve money, especially people who cheat other people, who trick other people so that they give up their money. And there's a whole industry, sadly, that is involved in that these days. So, Hishamru lachem, be careful, be on guard. Kivan shetihiyu ochlim useveim, since you will, or once you're able to eat and be satisfied. So you can see how we're moving from the previous verse to this one. Hishamru lachem, be on guard. Shelo tiva'atu, that you shouldn't literally kick. In other words, instead of being appreciative and incredibly thankful and grateful for the blessings you're experiencing, you kick at God. She'ein Adam mored b'Kadosh Baruch Hu, and Rashi goes on to make a general observation that a person generally doesn't rebel against the Holy One, blessed be He, ela mitoch sve'ah, except out of a sense of satisfaction, of being fully satisfied with all that they have. In other words, having plenty. Shinemar, as it says, and in Deuteronomy chapter 8, how it goes on to say, Pen tochal, lest you eat, vesavata, and you are satisfied, uvakarcha, and your cattle, betzoncha, and your sheep, your biyun, multiply. In other words, you're experiencing great wealth, etc. Mahu omer acharav, what does it say after that? Varam levavcha, and your heart become lifted, literally you become arrogant, v'shachachta, and you forget. And what is so concerning isn't this a description of what appears to be going on in the world today? Is this, in fact, a very perceptive statement as to why the world, to such an extent, is in a very sorry state? I mean, there are many wonderful things that are also happening, but nevertheless, it seems like this is a description of what exactly has happened. Vesartem, and you turn aside. Lifrosh min haTorah, to turn away from the Torah. Umitoch kach, and in this way, va'avadatem Elohim acherim, you'll wind up serving other gods. Shekevan she'adam porish min Torah, because once a person turns aside and dissociates himself from the Torah, holech, you go umidabek ba'avodat kochavim, you go and you cling to idols, right? The service, the worship of stars. V'chein David Omer, and so David says in Samuel 1, chapter 26, Ki gershuni hayom, okay? Because they have cast me away today. May histapech b'mnachalat Hashem, to be able to participate in the inheritance of God, Lamor, saying, Lech avod, go and serve the Gomer, etc. Mi amar lochen, who actually said this to him? ela kevan she'ani megorash. But what he really was trying to say is that since I am chased away literally, mila'asok b'Torah, from occupying myself in the Torah, hareini karov la'avod Elohim acherim, I am becoming very close, right? It brings me close, near, to serve other gods. This is why the study of Torah is, they say, Talmud Torah keneged kulam. The study of Torah is the equivalent of all the other mitzvahs. Elohim acherim, other gods. This is a sifrei. So what is the force of this word other? Other. Shehem acherim lo'ovdehem. Why? Because they are strange, right, to those who worshipped them. Right? They really don't have a relationship to people who serve them. So elav, he can scream to it, he can yell out to it, to this false god, ve'eno, and it doesn't. Sorry. Onehu, it doesn't respond to him. Nimsa asui la kenochri. You find, right, that it is, he is to it like a stranger, like a stranger. So I'm going to stop here for today. And let me see, here we are. Okay. Put in the marker. And if anyone has any comments you'd like to make at this point, please feel free. Go ahead, and I'm going to stop the share.
About feeding your animals first.
Yes.
I mean, I think that those animals were meant to be their livelihood and or their sustenance. And of course they would want to, you know, have them well fed and taken care of so that they can eat them or sell them or trade them. I'm not sure why that, I understand your interpretation is more like, oh, this is a compassionate thing to do, but it sounds like it's something they would want to do anyway because it's their livelihood.
Well, Lauren, I admire your rational way of thinking. On the other hand, when people are hungry or have an appetite or want to enjoy dinner, you know, they might say, well, look, we'll have dinner first and then I'll go feed the animals. It wasn't saying feed the animals, period. It was more of when you feed the animals and take care of them. And from this, of course, I would also infer the whole notion of taking care that when you are in a position of power and wealth, etc., you have a mandate to take care of those who are not in power because the animals can't feed themselves, right? So this whole notion of greatness, in my humble opinion, right, that the defining factor of any great civilization has to do with how they take care of their underprivileged. And sadly, there are so many people, Lauren, I hope you would agree with me, who clearly don't feel that. This whole idea of make America great again, you should forgive me, seems to be based on let's take care of us first. Let's take care of number one, and number one is me. And sadly, it goes against, I think, a very fundamental principle in the Torah. And we know that the prophets, Heschel, in his book about the prophets, one of the things he says that has stuck with me is he says, a prophet is a person who can't sleep because people are starving somewhere in the, especially in your community. If you have people who are homeless in your community, if you are people who are, who don't have food in your community, a prophet can't sleep over that because they care so much about what's going on for those people who are underprivileged. Look, it's a general position. I know that when you actually get down into this situation and do social work, it's a lot more complicated than simply feeding the hungry. But essentially, it's about that, you know.
Yeah, the only tweak I would make is I wouldn't make that analogy because they're not saying feed us first, they're saying feed us only.
Yes, yes, right. That's True, but you can get so involved in feeding yourself first that you don't have time to feed the others.
They don't want to. They want us to go away.
Yes.
They want everything that sustains us gone, and they want us to use all our resources paying for things that the government doesn't want to pay for anymore because it doesn't like them.
Hmm.
Make sure they're white.
Hmm.
But what I hope comes out more than anything else, because I'm not here to take pot shots so much. I'm here more to try and hopefully, you know, give you a chance to dip into the Torah a little deeper, that it's human nature. I mean, that's what we're reading about, and how amazing the Torah is, and how wise the words of the Torah are in terms of describing reality, and that when we ignore these things, we just fall into these traps. So, anyway, I hope this is helpful. Okay.
Um,
Yeah, yeah.
Rabbi,
Yes,
when you have a meal and you say a matzah, after your meal, don't you have to say grace after the meal?
you do. Having,
I don't do that, and I'm
okay.
sorry I don't.
Okay, Harlan, I don't either. Okay, I don't either. There was a time when I was trying to do it consistently, and I found at a certain point I was just saying words. So I basically reserve it for Shabbat. You know, it isn't I think the way I would say it is, there's the ideal Torah, and then there's the reality. There's the circumstances alter cases element of Torah. So I think what's really important is, do you never say Birkat Hamazon when you have bread, or do you say it at times?
No,
Okay.
I always say
Yeah.
over bread. Yes, I do.
Yeah. Well, I'm talking about the grace after meals. I
Oh,
And
thought
and
I
also,
understood you to say that you don't always say the grace after meals.
but the
I
But
don't.
motzi
yeah.
also acknowledges God as the provider of food.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes. So there's a whole discussion in Tractate Brachot about that, because we have the bracha rishona, we have this first bracha that's hamotzi, and then we have a bracha acharona. There's a whole category of blessings that follow. And basically they say, just as you acknowledge the one who's giving the gift after you've enjoyed the gift, isn't it a nice thing to thank a person for the gift you've just enjoyed? So that's the function of the bracha acharona. And also, there's also another element too, that if in fact we believe the verse, I think it's in Psalms, that says, Ladonai haaretz umloah, that is, to the earth is the Lord's and its fullness. In other words, that everything belongs to God. Well, if something belongs to someone else and you help yourself to it, what do we call that? I believe it's called theft. Well, if everything belongs to God, okay, and we simply help ourselves, in a sense, we're acting like thieves. Okay. So when you make that first bracha, you're acknowledging the one who is the true and ultimate owner of it. And in a sense, in that acknowledgement, you're also asking permission to take what you're taking. I think this is great, great. These are great, great spiritual lessons in terms of spiritual practice. Not to, again, Lauren, the word you taught me, entitlement. Not to feel we're simply entitled to these things. So you can also, if you understand the purpose of that bracha rishona, of making that blessing before you benefit from something or consume it, as an act to try and prevent you from feeling entitled. So, so I thank you all for bringing that out. I'm going to stop the recording at this point.